My neighbor Denise texted me a photo of a moving truck backing into my driveway before my husband had said a single word to me about his parents selling their house. That was a Tuesday. By that Friday, I'd drawn up a document that changed the entire shape of our marriage. This is still waters. Here's what she wrote. I'm Isla. I'm 33. My husband Grant is 35, and we've been married 6 years, together 9. We bought our house 4 years ago, a 3-bedroom in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus, the kind of place with a homeowners association that mails you a letter if your grass gets too long. I mention the HOA now because it becomes relevant later in a way I never could have predicted. Grant's parents, Carl and Diane, lived 4 hours south in a small house they'd owned outright since before Grant was born. Carl took an early retirement package from the auto plant 18 months ago, and ever since there'd been a low background hum of comments about how expensive everything had gotten, how the property taxes on their house made no sense for 2 people, how they'd thought about downsizing. I'd heard versions of this conversation at probably a dozen family dinners. It never felt urgent. It felt like the kind of thing people say for years without doing anything about it. Denise's text came in at 2:40 on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. A photo of a U-Haul, our address clearly visible on the mailbox behind it, and the caption, "Everything okay? Saw this pull in about 20 minutes ago." I called Grant immediately. He didn't pick up. I called again. On the third call, he answered from what sounded like a moving truck cab, background noise, road hum, and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, "So, funny story." It wasn't funny. Here's the actual story, pieced together over the next several days. Carl and Diane had listed their house 6 weeks earlier, without mentioning it to us. Sold it in 9 days to a cash buyer at a number Grant later admitted was about $40,000 under what a realtor would have gotten them, because they wanted it done fast. They'd told Grant exactly 4 days before the moving truck showed up in our driveway, and Grant had spent those 4 days trying to figure out how to tell me, which is a sentence that still makes something in my chest go tight when I say it out loud. That first evening explains everything about how this actually unfolded, so let me take it minute by minute. I got home at 6:15 to find 2 recliners already unloaded onto my front lawn, still wrapped in moving blankets, because the movers hadn't been told which room was which. Diane was in my kitchen, rearranging my spice rack, just to see how it felt. The exact same casual proprietary energy I'd later learn runs in families, whether they're related by blood or not. Carl was in the driveway, directing traffic like he'd lived there for years. Grant met me at the door with the exact expression of a man who knows he's about to have the worst conversation of his marriage and is hoping proximity to his parents will somehow shield him from it. There was no yelling, no raised voices. What actually happened was quieter than that, and I think it worked better because of it. I asked Grant to come outside with me, away from the house, and I asked him one question. Did you agree to this before or after they sold the house? He said after. That his parents had called him the day the sale closed, already packed, already committed, and framed it as a done deal. We're coming to stay with you for a bit while we figure out next steps. Phone call, not a request. He said he'd panicked. He said he didn't know how to tell his own parents no with a moving truck already loaded. I believed him mostly that he hadn't planned this. What I couldn't get past was that he'd known for 4 full days and let a moving truck arrive at my house before I found out from a neighbor's text message instead of from him. There's a particular kind of cold that settles in your stomach when you learn something enormous about your own home from the person standing outside it instead of the one standing inside it with you. That first week, I did something I'm not proud of, which is nothing. I let it happen. Diane took over meal planning within 4 days, reorganizing my kitchen around what she called Carl's stomach issues, which meant separate grocery lists, separate meal times, and a running commentary on how I season things. Carl took to watching television in the living room at a volume that made conversation in the adjacent kitchen genuinely difficult, and when I asked him to turn it down once, he said, without looking away from the screen, "You get used to it." Grant worked longer hours that first month than I'd ever seen him work, and I understood, even then, that it wasn't really about work. It was easier to not be home for the parts of the day where his parents and I were quietly negotiating territory neither of them realized was being negotiated. By week 3, I'd stopped cooking dinner most nights because Diane had it handled, and I noticed I'd also stopped feeling like dinner in my own kitchen was something I had a say in. The moment this actually shifted for me wasn't one big thing. It was a Tuesday, and I came home to find Diane had rearranged our living room furniture, moved my grandmother's side table, the one thing in that house that was unambiguously mine, out to the garage to make more room for Carl's recliner. She'd done it while I was at work. She told me about it the way you'd mentioned the weather. I didn't say anything to Diane that night. I went upstairs, and I did the thing that ended up mattering more than any argument could have. I opened my laptop, and I started writing down dates. When they arrived, when Diane took over meal planning, when the side table disappeared, when Carl started referring to the guest room, out loud, in front of me, as our room. I have a habit from my job. I work in claims adjustment, and you learn fast that memory is unreliable, but a timestamp isn't. I built a simple log, the way I would for any claim, and for the first time in 3 weeks, writing it down made me feel like I had solid ground under me again, instead of just absorbing things as they happened. Here's what I found once I actually looked at the timeline in one place instead of living it day by day. Carl and Diane had never once, in 3 weeks, mentioned an apartment search, a timeline for leaving, or a contribution toward groceries, utilities, or the mortgage. When I gently asked Grant, in week 3, what the actual plan was, how long, what the exit looked like, he said his parents had mentioned a few months maybe, while they get settled and find a place, which was the first time I'd heard anything resembling a time frame, and it hadn't come from Carl or Diane directly. It had come secondhand, from Grant, softened. What happened next is probably the part people will disagree about in the comments. So here's the full sequence instead of a summary. I didn't confront Carl and Diane directly. I went to Grant on a Sunday morning with my laptop, and I showed him the log. Not to ambush him, I told him I was going to do it, gave him a day's notice, sat with him at our kitchen table before either of his parents was awake. I walked him through 3 weeks of dates, and I asked him one question. At what point in this timeline did you and I ever actually agree to any of this? He didn't have an answer, because there wasn't one. Every step, the sale, the 4-day notice, the moving in, the indefinite timeline, had happened as something that was decided elsewhere and delivered to us as already settled. Grant sat with that for a long time. To his credit, once he actually saw it laid out chronologically, instead of feeling it happen to him piecemeal, something shifted. He said quietly, "I think I've been letting my parents make decisions about our house, because saying no to them has always felt harder than saying no to you." That sentence is the one I keep coming back to. We agreed that week on 3 things, and I want to lay them out plainly, because I think the specifics matter more than the general idea of setting boundaries. First, A firm 60-day timeline, in writing, texted to Carl and Diane by Grant. Not implied, not softened. 60 days from that Sunday to have a concrete housing plan in motion, whether that meant an apartment, a smaller house, or a rental. Second, a monthly contribution of $900 toward household costs starting immediately. Calculated honestly off our actual grocery and utility increase since they'd arrived, which Grant and I worked out together using 3 weeks of receipts. Third, my grandmother's side table came back inside. That day, no discussion required. Diane's reaction to the second point told me more than anything else in this whole story. She didn't argue about the timeline. She argued extensively about the $900, saying family doesn't charge family, that she'd raised Grant for 18 years without an invoice, that this felt cold and transactional, coming from me specifically, not from her own son. I told her, as evenly as I could, that I'd tracked our utility and grocery costs since they arrived against the same month the previous year, and the increase was $1,140 a month, so $900 wasn't even the full difference. It was a number I'd rounded down. She didn't have a response to the actual math. She had a response to the feeling of being handed math at all. Carl, for his part, said almost nothing during that conversation, which I've since learned is his version of disagreement. Silence, followed by a slow campaign of small noncompliance. The television volume didn't come down. The grocery list didn't shrink. But the 60-day clock started, in writing, with both their names on a text thread Grant kept, and that mattered more than I expected it to. Week 7 is when it actually got tested. Carl and Diane had made no visible progress on housing, no applications, no viewings I was aware of, nothing beyond a few vague mentions of looking into some places. I brought this up with Grant, calmly, with 11 days left on the clock, and asked what happened if day 60 arrived and nothing had changed. Grant, to his real credit this time, didn't soften it. He told his parents directly at dinner that the 60 days was a real deadline, not a suggestion, and that if they needed help with applications or a deposit, we'd help. But that day 60 meant day 60. Diane cried at that dinner. It was hard to sit through, because some part of me still felt like the villain in a story where I was mostly just asking two adults to eventually leave the house they'd moved into, without asking. Carl said quietly that he supposed they'd overstayed their welcome, in a tone clearly meant to make someone feel guilty for agreeing with him. Nobody took the bait. They moved into a 2-bedroom rental 11 miles away on day 56, 4 days ahead of the deadline, which I don't think was a coincidence. I think once the number stopped being abstract, Carl found an apartment within a week. The $900 monthly contribution had covered, by that point, just over $6,300 of actual household cost increase across those 7 weeks, and Grant and I used a portion of it, ironically, to help cover their security deposit, which felt like the right way to close that chapter. Not punitive, just honest about what had actually been happening under our roof the whole time. Diane and I aren't close exactly, the way I think she'd hoped we might become living under one roof. But she calls now, ahead of visits, and asks if a weekend works, and I've noticed she double-checks with me directly now instead of routing everything through Grant. I don't know if that's real growth or just her adjusting to a version of me she now knows keeps a log. Either way, it works. Grant and I are better for it, oddly. We'd been married 6 years without ever really testing what happens when his family and my house pulled in opposite directions, and I think some part of both of us needed to find out. even though I wouldn't wish the way we found out on anyone. My grandmother's side table is still exactly where it belongs. So here's what I keep wondering. How many people let something get decided everywhere except the one conversation where they actually had a say in it? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.